absolutely, Madhav, when you say that the investors are now sizing up their own exposure to the Adani stocks. Because there are many people who may think that I haven't invested in Adani stocks. Will it affect my life? Will it affect my savings? Yes, if your savings are tied to the LIC. Yes, if your savings are tied to the SBI and you're an account holder, and also there is massive debt that the Adani Group has incurred when it comes to some of the nationalized banks as well. Which is why we here on Times Now are going to break it up to you as to what it may mean for you, the investor, who may have exposure as well. Here's why. Because the LIC has an exposure of 0.975% of LIC's exposure is to the Adani Group. Of course, time and again LIC has said, listen, we have less than 1% exposure. It is not going to be a huge dent and we have enough safeguards. But nonetheless, there is a massive exposure, and if we break it down in terms of figures, it comes to an exposure of 30,127 crore rupees that LIC has invested in the Adani Group. Of course, there are reports which are saying that LIC continued to invest in the FPO despite the Hindenburg report strike which happened on the 24th. Let's also tell you how there is 0.55% of estimated banking exposure to the Adani Group. A lot of this exposure would be that of private as well as public banks. Now, these are figures which are coming out from the CLSA. The banks themselves have not given out any specific figures. It's important for us to point that out. But the RBI has asked all the local banks to figure out what their exposure to the Adani Group of companies has been, which they are currently underway. Meanwhile, there is 2.1 lakh crore rupees of consolidated debt of Adani's from the banks. As we were discussing, some of them are going to be nationalized banks as well. Of course, in addition to that, there is 3.4% of Adani Green Energy, which is held by Indian mutual funds. And if you have been one of the investors of the mutual fund, it's possible they too have exposure. But it doesn't seem to be, at least for the time being, analysts are saying that the exposure of Indian mutual funds are not extensive when it comes to the Adani Group. Also, when it comes to the other mutual funds, 2.8% of the Adani total gas have been held by Indian mutual funds as well. Another one of the companies of Adani, which is the Adani Green Energy, about 3.6% of the Adani Green Energy are being held by the Indian mutual funds as well. This is how people who may not have directly invested in the Adani stocks may still have exposure via either mutual funds or the LIC or the SBI, which is why the opposition is saying that it affects each and every Indian and crores are going to be affected by it. There needs to be a thorough probe into it.
Thanks so much for that, Meghna. And in fact, the opposition is demanding a JPC probe into this entire matter, or at least one that is led by the CJI. There have been repeated disruptions of Parliament right behind me. In fact, as I've been telling you through the course of the day, demanding a debate on this issue, asking for the government to come clean and set the record straight on this matter.
हमारी मांग ये है कि या तो जॉइंट पार्लियामेंट्री कमेटी बनाओ और इसकी इंक्वायरी करो, या नहीं है तो सुप्रीम कोर्ट के चीफ जस्टिस के नेतृत्व में कमेटी बनाकर इसको इंक्वायरी कराइए और डे टू डे रिपोर्ट बाहर करते जाइए.
My government must explain about the institutional oversight failure. If there was any failure at all, the government must come and say, no, the institutional oversight was perfect. They must explain that, but the government is only maintaining a silence.
इतनी बड़ी रिपोर्ट सामने आई है, 2 साल की रिसर्च के बाद आई है, जो ओवर प्राइसिंग की बात कर रही है, मार्केट मैनिपुलेशन की बात कर रही है, और उस पर आप संज्ञान नहीं ले रहे हो. ये दुखद है. जिस तरीके से कल पैसा वाइप आउट हुआ है जनता का, ये दुखदाई है.
We are saying the whole thing is morally incorrect, and we want an investigation, proper investigation into what has happened.
भारत के प्रधानमंत्री को सामने आके लोगों की चिंता दूर करनी चाहिए. भारत की वित्त मंत्री को सामने आकर ये बताना चाहिए कि आरबीआई क्या कर रही है, सेबी क्या कर रही है, ईडी क्या कर रही है, सीबीआई क्या कर रही है. इतने बड़े भ्रष्टाचार पर अब तक पूरी सरकार खामोश क्यों है?
At a time when the crony capitalism is ruling the roost in the business cycle and the stock exchanges are being shattered by that, there is a report coming from Hindenburg saying that there is kind of a manipulations, stock manipulations have been done, and many things have been said. We need to probe into that, and I tell you, other probe will not do. I am asking for the joint parliamentary committee to probe that.
Now, these scathing attacks come even as the group's chairperson Gautam Adani has clarified and given a statement on this issue.
For me, the interest of my investor is paramount and everything is secondary. Hence, to insulate the investors from potential losses, we have withdrawn the FPO. This decision will not have any impact on our existing operations as well as our future plans. We will continue to focus on timely executions and delivery of projects. The fundamentals of our company are very strong. Our balance sheet is healthy and assets robust. Our EBITDA levels and cash flows have been very strong, and we have an impeccable track record of fulfilling our debt obligations. We will continue to focus on a long-term value creation, and growth will be managed by our internal accruals. Once the market stabilizes, we will review our capital market strategy.
Now, this is perhaps why, in fact, several of these financial institutions, including the LIC, the SBI, and even departments of the government, have come out to assure investors that their exposure to the Adani Group is limited and that there are adequate safeguards in play. Now, listen into these reactions coming in.
Our exposure is to the assets, physical assets, and they are having adequate cash generation, and we have not experienced in the past any kind of a default from this entity, and we don't expect that we will have any challenge because the assets are having very robust cash flows. So as far as our lending is concerned, we don't envisage any problem on this particular account.
I think the exposure to any one company is so small that to connect the fortunes of any one company with those of either LIC or nationalized banks is, I think, not very justified or rational. I think the total exposures are small, and yes, there are always companies that do well and companies that do badly. Institutions spread their investments across a big portfolio, and I think there is less than 1% concentration of any one company at this moment which in the portfolios of any of these financial institutions. So I don't think that's a big enough concern. In fact, I don't think that is a reason for influencing the prices of public sector banks in the days to come.
Its ability to repay a loan depends on the profits, on the cash flows, which the banks believe are sufficient. The valuations is what the markets are looking at. It's not the cash flows, and the cash flows are looked after by the banks. Okay. So there's a difference.
Let's take this across to our guest. Joining us for more on this, we have with us George Kurian, political analyst. Manish Barriarr is also a political analyst. And Manish, let me come to you first. In fact, the opposition is saying that this is a very, very serious issue. It is public money at stake over here. And we're not talking about a small amount. We're talking about tens of thousands of crores, perhaps even lakhs or more, that in fact has been invested into these 10 entities by our various public sector units. And this is a serious issue when they lose so much of money at the bosses.
Yeah, hi Madhav. Good evening to you and good evening to all the co-panelists and the viewers. I think this was, it is very unfortunate that in our country, the entire opposition is talking about all that. It is unprecedented that they would talk about something in their own parliament about a company. Rather, they would promote those companies. So one, I think the entire opposition doesn't have any issue right now which they can really corner the government. And I don't know why they are cornering for one company. Most of the statements which you showed right now from the opposition, they were not facts. They were based on emotions. They were based on, in fact, wrong notions also. For example, if you look at Hindenburg, if people understand short selling, they'll understand that they earn money through selling shares which are going down. So it's completely political. And for them, it is business. But for opposition, it is more of political. I've gone through the entire Hindenburg report, and you will see that there is nothing substantial which they have talked about against Adani Group. Even the exposure, as you showed in your report, I was looking at some CLSA report and even Kotak Securities.
Well, Hindenburg's claim is that majority of those questions have not been answered by the corporate entity, but there's politics at play over here. Let me bring in George Kurian. George Kurian, in fact, the opposition has succumbed to the claims of a short seller. That, in short, is in fact what is being said by a co-panelist. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't quite agree to Manish here because he's trying to defend the indefensible. He said that the opposition is not trying to take this as an opportunity to corner the government, not at all. The opposition is concerned about the crores of investors who have invested their money, hard-earned money in LIC and SBI as their life savings. And I strongly believe that, the RBI has also sought the detailed report from the banks about the exposure to the Adani Group, and it is for the group to come out clear and gain the confidence of the investors and ensure that proper investigation into the Hindenburg report and research be conducted. And all that the opposition is demanding is a joint JPC, that is Joint Parliamentary Committee, be formed.
Very unprecedented.
And so that, one can come to a conclusion.
One at a time. George, make your point quickly. We have limited time.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying.
Manish, let him make his point. We allowed you to speak. Let him make his point as well. Quickly, George.
Wants to put at this point in time is an impartial inquiry into the entire issue about the Hindenburg's report. So that be it, and a joint parliamentary committee to get into the conclusions of the entire report, because to safeguard the investors' interest in this.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. George and Manish, I'm sorry we are completely out of time. We'd have liked a longer debate on this, but it's very clear that this debate is front and center as far as the Indian Parliament and politics is concerned. We are expecting disruptions tomorrow in Parliament as well on the same issue. We'll have to see how this entire issue plays out in coming days as well. For the moment, we're slipping into a very quick break.